Evening, everyone. I am calling to order our special board meeting on today, October 26th. Please call the roll.
President Adair,
Present.
Ms. Beckerly,
Present.
Mr. Brown,
Here.
Mr. Cole,
I am here.
Dr. Pierce, Mr. Ragland,
Here.
Vice President Reyes.
I think
You have
she
a
did
quorum?
say here because her light turned on, but we didn't hear her. So those in the back. What? Huh?
She technically.
Well, she's present, but she doesn't count for quorum, but she is here.
Oh, yes.
Okay. Thank you. So on today's agenda, we have a discussion with AJ Crable to continue discussing our strategies around goals and guardrails. So we are excited to welcome him back, and then we will adjourn. So that is all we are here to discuss today during the special meeting. Is there a motion to approve the agenda?
So
So
moved.
moved. Second.
Then a motion and a second. Hearing no objections, the agenda is adopted. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce AJ Crable from the Council of Great City Schools, who's joining us virtually today. Hi, AJ.
Good evening.
Go ahead and turn it over to you and the superintendent, I believe.
Yes.
Yes, much of what we're going to hear this evening will be guided by the superintendent. But before she jumps in and begins sharing, I just want to bring everybody back to center on where we are, how we got here, and what happens next. So it seems like years ago now, but the board decided on a path that it wanted to get very clear about what is the vision of our community, the things that our community wants our students to know and be able to do, and what are the values of our community, the non-negotiables that have to be honored by the school system as it pursues the vision. The task of the board then has been, over these many months, to listen for the vision and values of the community and then codify the vision into a coherent set of goals. These are smart metrics that describe what our students should know and be able to do, and codify the values into guardrails. These are policy statements that describe what are the non-negotiables that must be honored. Once the board has done that, the next step in the process is that the administration then identifies interim goals, interim guardrails, metrics that the board can look at throughout the year that provide evidence regarding whether or not the district is actually making progress in the direction of the community's vision while honoring the community's values. Once the superintendent has presented those and the board and superintendent have reached a place of agreement around the goals and the interim goals, the guardrails and the interim guardrails, then the administration can build out a set of monitoring reports and a monitoring calendar, and the board can proceed with monitoring progress relative to its goals, spending as much as 50% of its time each month in this activity as a specific strategy for creating adult alignment and driving performance improvement throughout the organization that is specifically aligned to the community's vision. Where we are today is that the board, having done its part, the administration is, after receiving feedback from the board, has come back with a revised set of interim goals that it now will present to the board this evening. We'll walk through those together. This is a great time for technical questions to make sure there's clarity and understanding around what things mean. I suspect as a result of this evening, it's entirely normal that the administration may then choose to make some adjustments. But then the next step after tonight is that ideally at the next board meeting, or at the latest at the one subsequent to that, is that the board then fully blesses its goals and guardrails with the understanding that they will be monitored using the interim goals and interim guardrails that the administration has presented. That then tees us up starting in January to have accomplished a significant redesign of the board's agenda such that time invested in monitoring progress is instrumental and favorite part of how the board spends its time starting in January and going forward. So that's where we've been, that's where we are, what we're doing tonight, and that is where it is intended to lead us going forward into the next several months. So just as a quick check-in with board members, what questions do you have about where we've been, where we are, and where we're going? Hopefully all of this is simply review for the nth time. Any questions board members have about where we've been, where we are, and where we're going?
Board Member Beckerly.
At some point during this meeting, are we going to talk about the implementation timeline in some detail?
Yes.
So that has been shared with board members, and that is a critical part of it. I think of that as part of the where we're going.
Okay,
and so at the end of our time together, after we've gone through the interim metrics, when we then start to wrap up and discuss what happens after tonight, we'll come back and look at that. But that document should have been distributed to all the board members. Did you all receive that document?
Yes.
This afternoon we did, yeah.
Perfect. Other questions about where we've been, where we are, where we're going before we proceed with asking the superintendent to dive into the interim goals?
It appears no one has any questions.
All right, excellent. Well, we're excited to dive in. Madam Superintendent?
Yeah, thank you, AJ. And thank you again to the board. I know we have been working with these, and there's been some anxiousness for us to get to this point. So thank you for your feedback. We wanted to have that feedback by 5 o'clock on Sunday so we can make adjustments to tonight's presentation. So thank you all that gave us that feedback that led to us strengthening the presentation for tonight. I have the team members here. They're on by Zoom. We will first start with Dr. Russell Brown, who will start facilitating the discussion along with our chief academic officer, Kira, and then we have Kelly Rivers, have a few of our executive team members, Kenny Lee, Kelly Rivers, and I think we have Leslie Kelly on too, an academic team, so that there's additional questions. So we want to make sure that the interim goals are like you, that we are listening and we have these goals exactly right, because we will, as AJ stated, we would go to our board implementation timeline, and then we're going to work on the calendar. It will be the next step that Misty and the team and I will work on. So we want to kind of wrap all of this up in the next few weeks if possible. So with that, and I know we have AJ into 7 o'clock, so we want to make sure that we get at least those two things done, go through the interim goals, and then do this go through the board implementation timeline by 7 p.m. So I will hand it off to our new Chief Performance Officer, Dr. Russ Brown. And I would like to say that Dr. Brown is familiar with this strategy. He worked with Council of Great City Schools as and in his position in Portland City Schools. So that's why I was so excited we were able to have him on our team. And he's also worked with CMSD in Baltimore County. So he brings a lot of expertise to this work and understanding of this work. And just really happy that he's another team member that can help us with this along with AJ. So I will turn it over to you, Dr. Brown.
So good evening, Superintendent Dixon, members of the board as well. Pleased to be able to join you this evening to be able to talk about the proposed interim goals. And I'm going to wait for a moment here to have the slide deck brought up. I'm also pleased to be joined by, again, members of our curriculum and instruction staff who are going to speak to part of this this evening as well, and we'll be here to answer questions if necessary as well. So now that we're up and running, let's go ahead and go on to the next slide, please. So today I want to spend a little time talking about our interim goals and how they support our final goals and our vision, and what those proposed interim goals are and how they came to be, and when they'll be available to be reported to the board and the community. So, next slide, please. I think interim goals are really an important part of a progress monitoring process, part of a very important part of a continuous improvement process overall. And the goals as they're set up show a progressive ladder of skills and experiences leading up to the portrait of the graduate. And we want the interim goals there to help us monitor our progress to each of the board goals during the course of the school year and across school years. So it's our way of sort of monitoring that progress as we move. And again, as a series of steps to the portrait of the graduate, we want every student in each school to see themselves in one or more of the goals, because we know that changes need to occur at all school levels. Next slide, please. We also, within the guardrails and how we've thought about the board has thought about the goals overall, it's really important that the interim goals also support equitable outcomes, and they should really provide, again, a catalytic effort for us to focus on growth goals for each student. If we're going to close achievement gaps, if we're going to raise student achievement, we then need to have ways to accelerate growth for our lagging student groups, and we need to have a targeted way to revisit that and be able to monitor that over time. And again, all of the above for me is framed in a continuous improvement cycle. Next slide, please. So again, board goals act, and the interim goals act as a foundation for a database continuous improvement cycle. They give us an opportunity to pause and reflect and then adapt our course. This to me is the core of a learning organization. And if we're going to be in a learning organization and move forward, then this is our opportunity to step back periodically, look to see whether or not our plans are leading to the outcomes that we desire. And if not, then to retool. And so again, it supports planning in those cases where, hey, things are working the way we want and we see the outcomes that we want, then it helps us consolidate and build upon that success. And on the other hand, if we're not moving in the direction that we want, then it gives us an opportunity to pause, step back, reflect, perhaps do another root cause analysis to dig in, and then move forward with an adaptive plan. So let's get to the goals. So starting with reading proficiency, this board goal, the board goals themselves, I just want to restate this, are unchanged. So the strengthening reading proficiency is the board adopted goal, and we're just going to talk about the interims that are in support of that. I will say that, subsequent to, backing up for a second, the baseline did decrease. So in the 2021 year, our proficiency for third grade was 23%. So the gap that we have to close to get to that 55% has actually grown. And the interim goals have been adapted to meet that need. So moving on then to our first set of proposed interim goals that lead up to reading proficiency. These act like a ladder. And third grade reading proficiency doesn't happen in a vacuum. It doesn't happen just in third grade. It happens as a product of kindergarten through third grade, or as some folks here would like to say, PK through third grade. I think the importance of pre-K will become even more evident as we move through this. These goals ladder up. So starting in kindergarten, we talk about the percentage of kindergarten students considered proficient on the diagnostic assessment. That's iReady. It's the iReady reading assessment. Or who have exceeded growth expectations will increase from 38.2%, which was observed in May of 2019, to 54% in June of 2026. And when we talk about exceeding growth expectations, that means that those students are not meeting the normative growth for that grade band, but instead meeting the stretch growth target. And the stretch growth target is what's necessary if students are going to close the gap to proficiency over time. These goals ladder up, so we go from kindergarten to first grade, and we see that first grade, it's similar structure goal, but we're moving from 31.8% of proficiency to 58% proficiency in 2026. And again, this essentially pays off with dividends. The investments you make in kindergarten by moving kids forward, having more kids mid or on grade level in kindergarten, then makes it easier in first grade because you're closer to your goal. Having more kids meet stretch goals gets them closer to where they need to be in terms of achievement. And then again, you move up through the ladder. And as that cohort progresses through first grade and then on to second grade, the ladder keeps going up. So finally, the final interim goal here is for second graders. And again, the percentage of second grade students considered proficient on the diagnostic assessment or who've exceeded growth expectation will increase from 32.7% in May of 2019 to 65% in June of 2026. And you have a full articulation of these goals over time in a document that I gave the board as well, where you have each of the interim goals, their baseline, and the expected outcome by year for each of the interims from kindergarten through third grade for each interim progress point. Moving on to our second goal area, closing achievement gaps. I refer to this the second because really when we think about the portrait of the grad is something that is attributable to a graduate. Well, you have to be a graduate first, and we have to get kids across the stage. It's our minimal sort of deliverable service to our community and to our kids. And then when we talk about the portrait of the grad and meeting a portrait of grad seal, it's that additional thing that we're providing, that additional value that we're providing to our community with that. Again, this goal, the board goal, was already adopted, remains unchanged. We know that we reported data to the goal to the board that the baseline here, again, due to COVID, did drop, so it went to 79.6. And again, that means that we have a little bit more of a stretch to get to our end goal in 2026 in August. Much like the early reading goal, this is a ladder of goals. When we think about graduation, again, graduation isn't simply an activity that impacts our seniors. It's a cohort activity. It starts in 9th grade and progresses forward. So if you're going to have sustainable changes in graduation rates, you have to impact the proportion of students who are on track to graduate in 9th, 10th, and 11th grade in order to better position yourself to have more students graduate in that final year of their career. So these goals, again, are set up as a ladder. We start in 9th grade, and we talk about the percentage of 9th graders who are on track to graduate, increasing from 57% that we observed in June of 2021 to 67% in June of 2026. And again, this just ladders up. So when we get kids to 10th grade, when we see that go from 57 to 67%. And then finally, when we get to 11th grade, we want to see that go from 59% to 69%. And again, you have a document that shows that ladder of those goals over time for each of the interim goals areas, as well as the overall board goal. And again, if you look at this and you watch what happens as a cohort proceeds from one year to the next, you'll see that those goals sort of build upon one another and lead ultimately to the graduation rate that we would like to observe in the end. So finally, moving on to our portrait-ready graduates, which is ultimately the vision for the system, vision for the community writ large. This goal remains unchanged. This is a new goal area, so we don't have baseline data for this. This is being developed as we speak. And so this one didn't get impacted by the pandemic because we're still in the process of developing it. So what are the proposed interim goals here? And part of this is really just talking about the implementation timeline here as we move towards where we need to be for a portrait of grad. And again, it's a ladder, and it's looking at developmentally, what are our expectations? So starting with 5th graders, we're talking about the proportion of 5th graders who will complete a charrette portrait will increase from 0% in June of 2021 to 80% in June of 2026. Again, we're trying to move towards a model where all of our students will eventually have completed a charrette project and will be embedding and deeply thinking about the attributes of a portrait of graduate as early as elementary school as part of their work. The second goal is, again, the percentage of 8th graders who complete portrait of a graduate personalization plan. It's, again, as kids are getting ready to go on to high school, beginning to really deeply think about what high school looks like and how they can build out and meet and be on track to meet the portrait of graduate seal requirements when they're in high school. And then finally, knowing that we're looking for 2028 for the final portrait of the grad numbers, well, again, we want to know where are kids in high school moving towards that, and our kids by the time they're midway through high school, do we have a sufficient proportion of kids who are on track to meet that final goal in the end? And so the final goal is the percentage of 10th grade students who are on track to meet the requirements for the portrait graduate seal will increase from 0% in June of 2021 to 30% in June of 2026. Now, those students in June of 2026 are your seniors in June of 2028. And your target for June of 2028 is 20%. And so 20 or 25. 25%, pardon me, I misspoke there, is 25%. And so having 30% of the students on track by 10th grade should comfortably have us in position to be able to meet that goal when those students matriculate to 12th grade. At this point, I'm going to pass things off to Mr. Lee, who's going to talk about, again, those interim metrics and how we're developing in those and how those are going to be implemented in pilots during the course of this year. Mr. Lee?
Thank you, Dr. Brown, Superintendent Dixon, members of the board. It's my privilege and pleasure to look at this slide that looks at how we are developing portrait-ready graduates. And this diagram, if you will, is first, if we start on the bottom, it really starts with the foundation. Again, this is something that was shared with the board back in April. We're bringing it back to you again and really emphasizing that students leading the way. That's our foundation. That is what everything is built on. It is our district's North Star. And then built on top of that are the 6 traits that as a community, as a district, we identified as those traits that we want Columbus City School graduates to take with them to a career, to college, to the military, to a post-secondary institution. So on top of that is our process. And if you look at this from left to right, you'll notice that we start with the Portrait of a Graduate continuum. And again, like Dr. Brown mentioned, this starts in pre-K, and it will follow students from pre-K as they matriculate all the way through to 12th grade. So what we've done since our April report is really look at 3 things that we wanted to embed into the charrette, into the personalized learning plan in 8th grade, and ultimately into the portrait graduation seal. First, we wanted it to be an inclusive process. We wanted to make sure that these very important outcomes were not built in a silo, that it came from the curriculum and instruction team without any feedback from the stakeholders who are either going to do it or who are going to be instrumental in implementing it. We also wanted to ensure that, again, following that tenet of students leading the way, that we really emphasize student voice and student agency throughout this process. And we're proud to have partnered with Patel, who obviously helped us with the portrait, articulating the portrait traits. We are partnering with them and really focusing on this idea of student voice and student agency, and even leveraging national models of other districts who are following this idea of how do we embed student voice and agency into the portrait of a graduate. And then finally, with the portrait graduation seals, we really want to emphasize this idea, and throughout all 3 of the interim outcomes, this idea of equity and access, and making sure that what we are designing and what is being built is accessible to all CCS students, regardless of the program or the school or the region, that there's equity and access built into this. And so for this year, we're looking at a pilot implementation. We're being really intentional about this pilot. We're focusing on regional balance, making sure that we have representation across the organization, that we ensure a broad snapshot of students, of charrette projects from different schools, from different programs. And we're also, as we implement these pilots, we're also identifying existing best practices, and that we have a lot of great things going on in our schools that are moving forward, the 6 traits. And we want to make sure that those are embedded and incorporated into our pilot implementation. We have curriculum writing teams right now made up of teachers who are working alongside our administrators, working alongside community partners to start framing out a lot of these projects. And we also have focus groups so that the products that these writing teams are creating, we're also vetting them through focus groups and getting their thoughts. And so that when we have the finished product ready for pilot implementation come second semester, that we have it in a place that we're really happy with. And then from the pilot implementation, we're looking at scaling from a pilot to district-wide implementation. And again, meeting those percent completion goals that have been shared. As Dr. Brown mentioned, this is part of a continuous improvement cycle or process that we want to embed a culture of yearly systemic reflection in the charrette, in the learning plan, in the portrait plan, so that they are up to date, that they also incorporate changes in pending changes in the district, in the state, in the country even, that we really want to make sure that these are maintained and up to date. And lastly, for these pilots, we want to hear from the stakeholders. We want to hear from the students, the families, the community members who are part of this process, and make sure that their feedback is incorporated into the next year's implementation. And so this cycle is something that we really think will make the Portrait of a Graduate very successful by the 2026-2028 benchmarks. And I'm going to pass it back to Dr. Brown.
And we're around to our final slide. So, we spent a bit of time talking about what each of the interim goal areas are and how they ladder up to the overall goal. And then, finally, we want to talk about, well, when's the data available for this? When could we actually do monitoring activities? And so when we look at strengthening reading proficiency, we would expect to be able to have the iReady data for grades K through 3 available in February. And then again, in July, we would have that interim data ready for K2 and the Ohio State test data for grade 3 available in July. That allows a little bit of time between the close of the testing windows in each case, or the first availability of the data and the presentation. Looking at closing opportunity gaps, again, thinking about our on-track rate for each of the cohort years in high school. Again, at the close of the semester, we'll have that data, give us a little window of time to work with it. And in February, we'd be prepared to talk about that for grades 9 through 12 as a mid-year point. And then again in July for on-track data for grades 9 through 11 and the preliminary June graduation data. And then, as you'll recall, we have an August graduation as well. And so the final goal data for the cohort graduation will be available in September following the August graduation date. And then finally, for the interim goals for the portrait-ready graduates, again, interim data will be available in February at the semester point for grades 5, 8, and 10. And then moving forward, we'd also have that available in July for grades 5, 8, and 10, following again the preliminary June portrait-ready graduates. And then finally, when our final graduation data is in and we have a final complete cohort, then we can finally talk about the proportion of our graduates who have also met the criteria for the portrait-ready graduate seal. So with that, next slide, please. I think we're ready to answer any questions you might have.
I'll start with Board Member Cole.
Thank you so much, Madam President. Thank you for this presentation. I have a set number of questions that I'd like to ask, and I'll try and move through them fairly quickly. On the portrait of a graduate side of things, you might have mentioned this before, but sometimes I need to hear things a couple of times. Is there an outside entity for portrait of a graduate that would be our kind of accrediting authority, so to speak? Is this a paradigm that is utilized by an outside authority that would otherwise be that kind of accountability partner, so to speak, for us? Who's our accountability partner institutionally? I see POG, I see Portrait of a Graduate as a model that is basically establishing what we want to consider our golden standard. I understand that and see it as such. But do we have a outside entity of us that's kind of our accountability partner? It sounds a bit as if Battelle for Kids is in some respect playing in that role, but do we have an official accountability partner as an institution holding us supporting our own golden standard. Am I making sense?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Board Member Cole. So Battelle for Kids has been a great partner for us in terms of establishing the Portrait of a Graduate. And to your point, we are identifying district partners. As you know, they work with districts all over the country with Portrait of a Graduate, many of which are at the same point of implementation as we are. And so we are working alongside these districts, learning from each other, sharing best practices in terms of implementing based along that idea of students leading the way, of really emphasizing student agency and student voice. And this has become a national emphasis because we know, and I go back to summer experience even, that when students have a voice and students are a part of the process, we know that their engagement goes up. And as we look at how we can engage students to take deeper ownership of their learning, this is where we feel that working alongside these districts that have a similar emphasis on student engagement, student voice, student agency to forward their portrait plans, we can learn from each other. And like you said, it's a great word. We're partnering with these districts to support one another as we, again, collaborate and build the best possible program.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. Yeah, I think it's really important for us to have a solid accountability partner that kind of acts as that outside entity for us that helps us deepen our understanding of our work, further our endeavors to that effect, and help us make ourselves even better for our students.
Yeah. Can I add to that? I think also when we think about how we got to the Portrait of a Graduate, all of those community partners, and we said to the community that we were intentional with this strategy to come up with those 6 attributes. So I said I think part of that accountability is reporting out to the community what we're doing, right, and how well our students are mastering each of these attributes. So I think that's part of the accountability that we can play. But I agree, in partnering with Battelle, and as we work on a portrait seal, we're working with ODE to make sure that that is a valid seal that you can achieve in Columbus City Schools. So I think those are a few of accountability partners that we can name.
Good. I would definitely love to see that institutionalized on our part.
Okay.
The other question goes to the goal setting side of things, and where we're trying to establish these long run and interim metrics, particularly around the use of iReady. So I have personal experience with iReady in a classroom setting, working with students formally to teach this curriculum and walk them through it. A very comprehensive piece. Fanfare for it seems to vary. But given the time requirements on a weekly and daily basis for iReady, and that information is fairly real time. I mean, you find out very quickly by day's end, literally by the end of a day, your building leader can look at that information and know where that student is at that point and work with their TBTs to improve, that student's standing. Why then does the goal overall, the long run goal, seem so low, seem so conservative, seem not as just low and conservative? Why is there, where is there opportunity, or why is there not? What are the barriers to increasing that goal? What are the barriers to ensuring that our students can achieve better with this iReady system as, part of our literacy to a major, cornerstone of our literacy initiative? And I want folks to understand very clearly that I'm asking as gingerly as I possibly can, not out of any, I know that there's been considerable thought put into this work. I do not take that for granted. I need folks to understand that. So those who have put the thought process into this and elbow grease and putting this before us. I greatly appreciate it. But I do want to know why it is that goal seems so very low and conservative.
You mean the strengthening reading proficiency
Yes,
goal?
ma'am. Yes,
Right.
ma'am.
So,
That
sorry.
only 50% of our children are at standard
yeah,
effectively 4.5, 5 years from now.
right. So we can have Kira or either Leslie can talk about, because this is one of the goals, remember we talked about it early on that we thought was, you guys wanted to be a little more aggressive than a goal, and this is one of the ones that we modified. And then we can tell you how we got to that, Kira, the Leslie, because this is one we were very intentional, because we heard you when you said it was too low. And so I want to speak to the modifications that we made. Is either Leslie or Kira? Or,
May I ask?
Yes.
My understanding today, though, was that we were looking at the interim goals. The board goals have already been adopted.
Yep.
Yep.
And so, AJ, would you wish to weigh in on that in terms of process?
Yeah, certainly. So as a normal part of the process is the board receives the interim goals. It is absolutely normal that the board may then, looking at the interim goals, begin to question whether or not it accurately identified the goals it intended. That's not unusual at all. It winds up triggering usually a separate conversation of, okay, are these the right goals? Do we need to select something else? I actually don't hear that question being triggered yet. What I think I'm hearing is more of a desire on the part of the board member to get an understanding of why are we where we are and why this selected as opposed to something else. But to the extent that that inquiry comes up in response to looking at interim goals, that is incredibly normal. Same thing with interim guardrails. As the board starts to look at how we're going to progress measure the community's values, it's very normal that then the board will think to itself, okay, maybe we didn't word these the way that we intended. Maybe we didn't accurately capture that. And so as I'm listening, I don't hear that yet. I just hear an inquiry around it. But obviously, Cole can speak for himself on that point. But if that does come up, then that is a reasonable and appropriate thing to come up. And the board can, then pivot accordingly. I don't hear that yet. But if we do get to that point, it's not inappropriate. What I would do though is I would set aside time at a separate meeting so that we to dive into that if there is a belief on the part of the board that a change needs to be made, and only for the purpose of getting through the remainder of the interim goals. Because if the board wants to change one of them, I'd rather get through all the interims tonight so we can figure out maybe there are two of them that the board wants to change, and I don't want to just do that all at once. And so only for the purpose of expediting through the interims this evening, would I not do a deep dive into that. But if board members think that you want to change them, then let us know. My recommendation, we call a special meeting later this week, early next week, to immediately dive into that.
I thank you. I think for sake of moving to rephrase my question, the way I'd like to look at this, and I still think my question is valid.
I think your question is.
Okay.
Yes. So, but
I had the same question.
Then I don't
But we
understand your question.
go back. It goes back to, I think, his conversation we had early on about we were not being aggressive enough and it was
Right.
too low.
The questions around one, and this is what I'll add to it as a part of my third question. So it's all on the table.
55% acceptable.
We can't undo that now. I'm sorry, I'll shut up. Go ahead, I'm sorry, Mike.
No worries. I thank you. What I'd like to establish is, are these interim goals that build up to the goals that we finally approved, right? Are these goals augmentative? Are they enhancing where our students are in percentage of readiness towards portrait of a graduate? So for example, if you were to say 36% of our kids right now today are portrait of a graduate ready, according to the metrics and things that we've set in that paradigm, right? Does this added 20-something% bring us to that 56 is this augmentative? Is this enhancing of the current goals that we have established? Because what I'm seeing here is just really very incremental, and yes, it's normal, very incremental growth steps. To me, that come to at best like 6% per annum. And I'm just wondering, again, given particularly with the use of iReady, the immediacy of information that can be drawn down from that on a building for building, child for child basis, it just seems as if the aim is still too low, too conservative. So I'm going back to that question, but I'm asking it in association to, how augmentative, how big a jump will we ultimately see overall by 2026? Is that 56 or 54% really going to represent an overall 70-something% because it augments what is already in place? Or are we only going to see, again, half of our kids, POG ready?
Can I jump in and ask a maybe follow up? And looking at the diagram, which you haven't shown us yet, but if we go backwards, and so you look at them as individual students matriculating through, and if you look at where we're going to say a kindergarten student is going to be, let's say, going backwards from the goal of 2026. So if that's their third grade year, the first kindergarten is 2022, 2023, and we're saying we want them to have 45%, and then we do see an increase every year, but then when we get to the final goal of the third grade, it goes down. And so if they're progressing, there's a huge jump actually between first and second grade for this cohort, and then expecting, them to just hit the 55. So I know that this has been discussed. So and I know that we gave you the 55, or you helped us come to the 55. And so now that we've done that work, back to Cole's point, maybe the 55, now looking at what you said our kids could get to, does appear to be too low, especially if you look at it based on cohort going through year by year. So I don't know if we can.
Right, and I think, just want to make sure we're clear on the ask. We were told that we should not mess with the board goals.
Correct.
So even though this was brought up earlier, Board Member Cole and others, so we were just working on the interim goals because we knew in order to go back, as AJ stated, we would have had to have a separate conversation to come back to change the goals that you agreed upon. So Jennifer, you're right.
But what I guess I'm saying is based on your work, forget that. You're right. We can't change that in this meeting. That's not what we're doing.
Right.
But based on your work, what you've done is you have told us
Yes.
that our kids can do better.
Correct.
It's a different measure.
It's a different measure.
It's iReady versus OST.
Right. And so
it's
we couldn't.
predictive.
There you go.
Okay.
Thank you.
So
I'm sorry, I know I'm talking out of turn, but I knew
no,
that
but
was
that's
what was
right.
thank you for
That's
the
a really
clarification.
key
Yeah.
point.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's why
So-
the percentages are
Are
crazy.
different.
as well.
That's why the percentages, because it's predictive, and so iReady,
Yes.
the iReady score. So in my example, the kids, the 58% in second grade. So maybe that isn't wrong. The 55. How do the scores translate from iReady into the OST typically?
So the interim goals as they're written actually pick up two things. They're picking up the proportion of students who are reading mid-grade level or above. That's the on-grade level component. But they're also incentivizing kids to meet stretch growth. Because if we do not meet stretch growth for our kids who are significantly below grade level, we will not move the achievement numbers. And the stretch growth goals are designed to put children on a pathway to proficiency. And in some cases, it's a multi-year pathway if kids are more than a year behind. So the numbers pick up both on grade level as well as the proportion of students who are meeting the stretch goal goal. So those numbers by necessity have to be greater than the end target. The end target in the end is reading on grade level in 3rd grade.
That makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
Thank
Hold
you,
on, I'm not
Jake.
sure, we all jumped in on Cole's question, so I see Brown in a
Because we all had
second.
it, I think.
But let me make sure Cole's finished, and then we'll go to Brown.
I thank you, Madam Chair. I yield.
Okay, and I know Board Member Ragland did have his hand up. I don't know, no, he's, okay. All right, so we'll go to Board Member Cole.
Just
Brown.
helping me to
Brown.
understand and make sure I understand the point you've made and you know, the issue. One of the things that I think is also important is that we get this process up and running. And that's going to take some extra effort at the beginning. And we're going to learn from it enough to make valid adjustments as we go forward. But we'll have real data instead of assumptions and guesses to some extent. And I think that for those reasons, we may want to hold off with making changes to our goals at this point. And let's focus on, certainly we want to get the current students as far as we can. That's always important. But we also need to make sure that we implement this properly, that we make sure it's operating well, that we work out the kinks as we're going forward. And I think, you know, at that point, with a little bit more experience doing it, that we can make adjustments, you know, that are more meaningful.
Board Member Beckerly?
Okay. I just want to thank you, Russ, for explaining that so well. And for some back and forth you gave me in emails, helping me to understand that in terms of the importance of growth. And I just want to say, my understanding of that, because I think it's important that everybody understands that, the significance of what Russ said for our district is that we will be doing something very different than we've done before, which is at every analysis of every round of test scores, how kids are doing at staff meetings and TBTs, as Michael mentioned, all these things. We're going to be focusing on both growth and proficiency. And in order to hit these percentages, we have to have, these percentages of kids have to either be basically, and am I correct, Russ, that they're all going to have their own trajectory? So each
Yes.
kid, so if you have a kid that's 2 years behind, they're going to have a really steep slope. And they don't get included in this percentage unless they hit that slope. And so that, I'll stop talking other than to say that this is really significant because it's going to change what's happening in the classroom and how the teachers are analyzing the kids. And so this is really big. And I just wanted to acknowledge that because I'm very excited about that. Are we asking beyond this particular goal?
Yeah, any question pertaining to the presentation?
To what they just done.
Okay. Then the next question I had or a bunch of questions or clarity I'm looking at, is for the interim goals for goal 3. And I think maybe I just have to kind of come back to, in my mind, and I think this is in part picking up on Michael's question about, do we have a partner that's accountability partner? We're making this up, and this is what's really exciting about it. We're creating this from scratch. So we're also going to have to create how we are monitoring it and measuring it. And so I was surprised, and maybe this is the best way to ask this question. While I don't question at all the wisdom of the charrette or the wisdom of the personalized plan in terms of being part and process of what we do as we're making our students portrait ready. I'm almost wondering if we're premature in assuming those are what the interims are going to be because we haven't built out or we haven't come up with the end game yet. And so I'm almost, either we're further along in building this thing than I realize, or than has presented to the board, I suppose I should say it that way, unless I missed it, but I don't think I did. Or I'm almost wondering if, while I'm not saying don't do the charrette and don't do the personalized plan, but I'm almost wondering if we should make sure we have the right interim goals and get a little further along in the creation and the building out process. So that's really my question, because I'm sort of surprised to see that at the end of this calendar year, we're expecting to have metrics to look at, because I feel like we don't quite know what we're doing yet at the other end. We don't know what it's going to look like in the 12th grade. So that's the conversation I'd like to hear a little more about, because I'd hate to be locking in too soon on that which will ensure we're getting to where we need to be, since we don't really know exactly where we're going to be and how it's going to look. So that I wouldn't mind hearing some conversation along that lines.
This point, just as point of clarification, Madam President, is your question, just so I understand, is your question, if I were to distill it, are you asking where are those alignments and connectors on any given set of grade bands? So you're basing this obviously on OST standards, right? State standards, state requirements, and how we look at exceeding that. Are you asking whether or not we have a clear picture of what 3 through 5 looks like, what 6 through 8 looks like, in alignment with this stuff?
No, I don't think that's what she's asking.
That's not what she's asking? Okay.
Well, I'm talking just about the portrait one.
Goal 3.
3.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'm
And-
sorry. My
and-
brain is not connecting to
And
that.
so I'm saying that it doesn't, we haven't built it out yet, so I don't want us to lock in on how we're going to measure how to get there too soon. I'd rather
Okay.
build it first.
Kira?
Yes, so thank you. One of the reasons, part of the reasons that these have been identified as our interim goals right now is the charrette and the personalized plan represent or are meant to be summative of what students have experienced with the portion of our graduate competencies throughout their education to that point. So it's meant to act as a culmination of where they see themselves and where they want to go as it relates to portrait of a graduate and the competencies. And then I will pass to Kenny to talk a little bit about what the building process has looked like thus far to help the conversation determine if these are the interim goals that you all agree to.
Yeah, thanks, Kira. I think it's a great comment that was made by, I think, Board Member Brown that describes this process. We are in kind of combining and building off of what Board Member Beckerly said. This is exciting work. It hasn't been done. We're creating. And at the same time, we're also, to Board Member Brown's point, we're also having to make assumptions. And we have a pretty good idea of where the 5th grade charrette will go based on our design, based on, again, the feedback loop. But one of the exciting things that I know I mentioned to the team is that I'm really excited to see how a 5th grader, for example, sees themselves within the 6 traits. And while all of us have an idea of where it could possibly go, I'm really excited to see where our 5th graders who are able to implement be part of the pilot process, where they take the charrette. It could be collaborative. It could be composing a symphony that is a musical piece that talks about the 6 traits, that speaks to the 6 traits through music. It could be a piece of artwork. And so that's really one of the exciting things. You could integrate technology. And so when we look at that 16% marker for completion of the charrette, that's where we believe that through the pilot implementation, we will have this current group of fifth graders, at minimum, we're hoping 16% complete a charrette. Obviously, we would want it to be more. And then with the 8th grade personalized learning plan, we are looking at having, again, I think 16% of that group complete a personalized learning plan. But of course, we want it to be more. And the more students that complete, the more data that we get that will enhance the product the next year. And to board member Beckley's point, as students matriculate through the PK2 band and the 3-5 band, and we embed the portrait curriculum integrated into our general core classroom, the charrette project that a kindergartner now or preschool student now creates in 5th grade is going to be that much deeper because of their exposure to the portrait curriculum. And again, when you think about the current kindergartners going through and they're in 8th grade now, their personalized learning plans are going to look significantly different than the 8th graders who complete a personalized learning plan this year. And then to the last point about the portrait seal, we're looking at creating a system that really honors the current programming that we have in place, but also factors in the state graduation seals that our students are currently earning, as well as the local seals. And when you synthesize all of these different points, this is where we think the portrait seal is going to end up. I am very confident to say, having been a high school principal, that the 6 traits that make up the portrait of a graduate, our schools are doing that right now. And our students are engaging in that work right now. And we want to design a system that integrates all of these different processes and best practices that our schools are doing and come up with a really great portrait seal that is reflective of what our Columbus City Schools students and graduates can do.
Okay, and so all of that is wonderful, and that's why we're so excited about the work, but it seems to me that it's quite possible that, and that's what I mean, I'm not saying don't do the charrette and don't do the personalized plan, but the data you get from that and the input you get from that is going to influence or inform how we define the standards, the checklist, whatever it is that will earn you the seal, right? It's quite possible that once we have those seals defined, based on the input you're getting from the charrette and the personalized plan, that you're going to say, oh, wait a minute. The way we know they're on target to get this is something that's entirely different than completing the charrette itself. So even, or maybe what makes sense, and I think, AJ, we need your help here a little bit, maybe the goal for years 1 and 2 is complete the charrette and complete the personalized plan and increase that percentages. And then we revisit because interim goals can be 1 to 3 years, and then we revisit based on, by then we'll know. So our short-term goal is get all the kids doing as many kids as possible doing this, and then we revisit it at that moment within the 5-year thing and the 5-year overarching goal, and say, okay, this is how we're going to make sure they're on track to get to those the seals because we know them. Does that make sense? I mean, I just feel a little bit like.
Can I try asking your question, like, as I'm hearing it? So it
Yes.
sounds like you don't have any problem with interim 3.1 and 3.2. Where you're stuck is 3.3, about how do we know if our 10th graders are on track to meet the portrait seals if we don't know what the portrait seals are?
That's one of it, but I also have problems with 3.1 and 3.2 because I'm not sure that the best way to I don't think anybody knows at this point, the best way to tell if the 5th graders and the 8th graders are on target is completion of the charrette and the completion of the portrait of graduate. And maybe something entirely different, like having engaged in a group project that has technology empathy and, something else, global, critical thinking and communicate, it may be that we decide the best way to know if the 5th grader's on, or the 8th grader's on target.
That's not what these are measuring, though. 3.1 and 3.2 are just measuring completion of these two pieces.
Right, I'm saying choosing those two things as the interim goal. We don't know enough about what the end thing looks like to know what the interims are in order to say they're on target. Because they're supposed to show that we're on target.
That's why this causes me no angst, though, because 1 and 2 are it's foundational data.
Right, but it's going all the way to 2026. That's what I'm saying. Maybe we once we know more about what it looks like at the end.
I don't know.
If they're off, you
I'll
revisit.
jump in here. So 2 things. One, I strongly encourage the board to get through all of its interim goals this evening so that you're in a position to be clear about, are you comfortable proceeding or what our next steps are? But you can't really come up with a clear set of next steps if we don't get through all the interim goals. So I've asked before, but I certainly want to reiterate, I want to bifurcate conversations about the goals themselves. Let's hold on to those. And at the end of this conversation, if we need to go back and have the conversation, then let's schedule time for that. As it relates to the interim goals, I think the issue that I'm hearing, Carol, is concern about the term of the interim goals being so long that the administration might be tempted not to come back and revisit them in the face of new learning as you go through this process. I think a reasonable,
Yeah.
I think a reasonable, so 2 things. One, I think just administration, know that Carol is correct. Generally speaking, your interim goals and interim guardrails tend to last between 1 to 3 years with an understanding that as we learn things, we pivot. And also understanding that things that are predictive in the beginning of an implementation cycle may be less predictive by the end, and something else entirely may be more predictive by the end of an implementation cycle. And so for that reason, interim goals generally run 1 to 3 years. I certainly encourage you for something that is brand new that you've never done before to adhere to that with an understanding that you may set interim goals for a 3-year period, but at the end of your pilot period, be like, guess what? We learned something else. We're gonna do this instead going forward, and just come back to the board and say, we learned some things. As it turns out, we're part of a learning institution. Learning is a positive thing to be cherished and celebrated. But as a result, we do want to pivot on some of the interim metrics because we found things that are going to be more predictive, that are going to give the board more accurate data than we could have known possible before implementation. What that means as a practical matter is that I encourage you all to get comfortable with the not knowingness of new implementation for right now. And understand that in the spring, my expectation is that your data will still say 0 across the board for this particular set of progress measures. But then as part of you, but you should still monitor it. You should still clarify because maybe it won't say 0. And so you still monitor it. But then as part of those monitoring reports, your administration will be giving you heads up on where they are in the piloting and the and starting the implementation process. And so all that to say, I don't think you're in a dangerous place right now. I would encourage the administration, particularly for any interim goals or interim guardrails, 1 to 3 years, but particularly for this set, since we're in a place where our predictive powers are completely at a loss, to just cut the interim goals off at 3 years. So they run from June of 2021 to June of 2024 at most, at absolute most.
So we have Ragland, Brown,
No,
Pierce.
I yield.
Okay, then we have Brown, Pierce.
And very briefly, I wanted to go back to the conversation about accountability. As I thought about it more, it's the board that has that role. No, we're not an independent outside organization, but in the system, we are the ones that hold everybody accountable who's doing these things.
That's not quite what I meant by the statement, but I appreciate your
Yeah.
feedback.
No, and I understand having independent, third party looking at things, but
Third-party academic experts.
I think the conversation needed that point, a reminder.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Pierce?
So my question relates to goal number 1, and this goes across interim goals 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3. The way that these progress measures are written, it's almost from, or the way that I would understand it is that it's almost from a deficiency perspective. Because if you have a student that is taking the diagnostic assessment and scoring lower than proficient on the standardized state exams or third grade reading guarantee, then they're given an expected growth. What about our students that are already past that? Like they've met the third grade reading guarantee and they're good. So what happens to those third graders that don't have to necessarily show this exceeding growth? For me, I think that's critical because it shows that when it comes to this goal, we're only focused on those third graders that aren't proficient. How are we also motivating, educating, encouraging, enhancing, accelerating those third graders that have already met that mark?
So the way the goal is structured, it actually, again, supports not just looking at proficiency. And Dr. Pierce, I particularly don't like looking just at proficiency, because often looking at just at proficiency ignores students who are either well below or well above. And while it's important that we move more kids across that proficiency threshold, that shouldn't come at the expense of students who are advanced also continuing to accelerate. And one of the things that I like about the iReady platform is that it does set growth goals for all students. It's just imperative that the students who are below proficiency meet stretch goals in order to be able to close that gap in achievement and opportunity to finally get to the achievement. But that does not preclude the idea that the students who are accelerated or advanced would be able to maintain that growth over time as well. And iReady supports setting those targets so that we keep those students at those higher levels of proficiency. So I think it's imperative that we have this conversation about growth and continue to monitor growth over time.
And I appreciate that, but looking at the language, it says considered proficient on the diagnostic assessment or who have exceeded growth expectations. So as I anticipated, we'll see data on those students who are considered proficient, not proficient. That exceeded growth piece for me becomes important. What type of data are we going to see around that exceeded growth? And I, in a new millennial type of technology world, I appreciate how many times we've said iReady tonight. But iReady isn't the be all get all. It's not. We have to think there's other softwares and measures that will help our students learn. So how are we showing that exceeding growth for students who are already proficient or exceeding proficiency?
So students who exceed growth, irrespective of where they start, will be counted towards this. That could be a gifted student who exceeds their growth target, or it could be a student who's well below proficient who exceeds their growth target. Again, I think we need to talk about having an expectation that students will, minimally make a year's worth of growth during an academic year. And for students who are substantially below, then if we're going to close gaps, if students are going to close those opportunity gaps and get to a place where they have moved from learning to read to reading to learn, then they have to accelerate their learning and they have to have more stringent growth targets.
Doc, I appreciate where this is going. So again, what this makes me think is that we need a subset of data within these percentages that will be given that will highlight the students that have shown 1 year growth, 2 years of growth, and that will be disaggregated by student population, potentially students that are gifted versus students that are in our special need programs. Does that make sense?
I understand what you're saying in terms of disaggregating the data in terms of who's meeting what growth target. And I think it's important for us to be able to understand that. I know that when we were working in Cleveland, we spent a lot of time talking about the performance index specifically for this, because we wanted to be monitoring students at all levels of student performance, not just around proficiency. So I absolutely agree with you that it's imperative that we keep track of that at all levels of student performance. And I agree. We talk about iReady because it's the tool that we have right now, and I think it's important that we have a consistent tool over time for measurement in particular. And the measurement properties associated with that particular tool are more than adequate for predicting outcomes on the OST. There are other tools that do that as well, but I think it's really important that we stick to one measure at this point in time for consistency's sake, for ease of maintaining this conversation over time, but probably more importantly, for ease of experience for our families and staff who have to learn how to use these new tools.
I appreciate that. I think if we go back on the record, you'll see that both you and I agree on keeping the software, moving with it, and going with it. Again, I just understand there's other stuff out there other than iReady. But the gist of your response is that based upon this information that's been shared, the data that we as a board can expect to see will also include subsets of data that will allow us to see how multiple student populations are progressing on goal 1 outside of just proficiency.
I think it would be short-sighted to just look at proficiency, to say the least. So I do think we need to disaggregate this data and look at both growth and proficiency, yes.
You're all but giving me a yes. Are we do we have that data? Can you supply that data? If we ask for that data next semester, could we get that data?
We obviously we have the data associated. Yes.
Right, there we go. I got a yes. All right.
What I'm hedging on is really, again, the board monitoring process. And I think we have to talk about the board monitoring process and what that looks like, because
that was the part I was going to speak to, is that right now the conversation, I really want to encourage the board to focus in on the interim goals, because that is what is up for debate this evening. So will there always be other information that you all can have access to outside of the monitoring conversation? Certainly. You're the elected officials. Whatever information you ask for, if the district got it, you wind up getting it. But the conversation here is the board as a body comfortable with the superintendent's interpretation of your goals? And that interpretation is revealed by the interim goals that are presented before you. And so to say yes suggests that you are comfortable that these metrics and these metrics alone will be how you measure and how you progress monitor your goals. It doesn't mean it's the only data you have access to. You'll separate and apart, you'll be looking at other stuff. But for example, when you evaluate your superintendent, you're saying that this is the data that you're looking at to evaluate your superintendent. When you are making key decisions about your budget, you're saying this is the data that you'll be looking at for that. And so it does not take any other data off the table. You'll always have access to that. But it does suggest that this is the data that you're defining as the key decision-making data. And the reason that's important to be clear about is because it will stand alone. In your monitoring reports, you will have this data, not a lot of other data. Your monitoring reports will generally be 3, at most 5 pages, front and back of one page, front and back of a second page, front and back, front of a third page, 5 pages. And so the monitoring reports are intended to be accessible to any member of the community, any parent. And so having them be 30, 50 pages long with a lot of different types of data treated differently doesn't accomplish that. And so that's why it's really clear, that's why I'm reiterating this. It is a very small chunk of data that you use for your official monitoring work. And what you all have to ask yourselves is, are we comfortable with the superintendent's interpretation that's before us, the data that's before us, for the function of monitoring? And if you are, then we're good to go. And if you're not, then your access to altering that is to go back and change the goals. But I just want to clarify that, so that yes, there will always be other data, but this is the only data to be considering for the purpose of monitoring.
If I can just, this seems like a very cyclical conversation, because we're giving insights on what will help us as a board understand how our students are progressing, right? And so while I understand it's very important to frame the interim goals and the goals in this concrete, very concise way, I think we all appreciate that and benefit from the conversation we're having tonight. At the same time, we've all shown like these nuances of where additional information will help us. And so while that additional information might not be in the monitoring report, it could be in an executive summary that's given to us. It could be given in that videotape presentation that we've discussed earlier. And so I think the conversation that we're having right now is to consider the possibilities for additional information to be given to us. So when we do come and see the growth or see the percentages as they increase or decrease, we know the context and the story behind it.
Okay, so we have 12 minutes left with AJ.
So, thank you. Are we good with the interim goals? Because we need to get to the implementation, or do we need to reschedule more time?
Recommended so far is that, particularly for the for your third one, that you modify those down to no more than 3 years, recognizing that, and I described 2021 as your baseline year. So my expectation is 2021 will be at zero. June of 2021, you'd be at zero. But again, you all may outperform that. You may be able to roll out a pilot quicker than that and have reliable data in that time. But contemplating 2021 as your baseline going out 36 months from there. Other than that, I haven't heard other recommendations from board members that they would want to modify the goals in light of being uncomfortable with these as the interim goals. But let me put that out there as a formal question. Are there any board members who, given these as your potential interim goals, feel a need that these don't adequately capture the board's intention, such that the board needs to revise its goals to clarify its intention? Are there any board members who are wanting to make changes to the goals in the face of these interim goals?
Okay, so we have Board Member Cole and Ragland. You want to speak?
I'll yield to
Ragland?
Mr. Ragland first.
Thank you, Madam President. My question is just about interim goal 3.2 and why 8th grade was chosen for the completion of the personalized plan. Did we consider earlier grades in that, and what was your justification for 8th grade? That's all I'd like to know.
Remember, Ragland, 8th grade is a critical transition year. And so we identified 8th grade going into 9th grade. We really wanted to ensure that in grades 6 through 8, our students had experiences that exposed them to different career paths, that exposed them to different disciplines and content areas and more depth. And so when they get to 8th grade, as they're making that critical choice to go into a high school, to make that choice to go to a high school and to choose a program potentially, that there's a mapped out plan. And when you think about our 8th graders going into 9th grade, some stay within a pathway and some go outside and they move around through different regions. And we wanted to ensure that that personalized learning plan followed the student, and that the 9th grade counselor in their high school had information that would be able to personalize, customize their learning the second they walk through that door. that the schools had information, relevant information. For example, I think what it was mentioned today about having a strengths finder, an academic strengths finder, a career inventory that would be with that student as soon as they walk through the door in 9th grade. And so that is where we really want to do that. And then also 8th grade supports board goal 2, interim 2.1, in that we believe that with those personalized learning plans, it's going to enhance our students' ability to stay on track at the end of their 9th grade year, because this plan is intentional.
And so there was no discussion about any earlier time in their academic career, like maybe 7th or 6th grade. I mean, I was just, for me, it seems like there may be some opportunities if we get them a little bit earlier to help in all of those things that you consider to be attributes. But if they're looking at a personalized plan in 6th grade, that may benefit them for what they're doing in 7th and 8th grade as well. But I just wanted to know if that was ever a part of your discussion, Mr. Lee.
Board Member Eglin was part of the discussion as we were building out and creating this plan, as we talked about tonight. But again, we really felt like 8th grade was critical to also target on track for graduation and engagement throughout high school, and that this personalized learning plan was really the tool to help and a vehicle to help students reach graduation and stay on track, particularly from an engagement lens.
Appropriate to move forward with having in mind that this is a living plan that will contract, expand, reveal or not, that we're willing to grow with. That's my mindset as of now. Without getting too further in the weeds, for me personally, and I get the feel from my colleagues as well, but definitely for me personally, it's time to begin executing and seeing where we actually go. So,
Yeah, I strongly agree on both points. One, that this is a living process, that the intention of monitoring is to make adjustments in real time, not to dogmatically follow a plan just because it's a plan. If it's still the right plan based on the monitoring, then you still follow it. But if it's not the right plan based on the monitoring, then you adapt. And the second part I strongly agree with. It's time to implement. The time for discussing this exhaustively. I would encourage the board to set that aside and to move forward with implementation, with the understanding that there's going to be learning and adjustments to take place going forward.
Vice President Reyes and Beckerly.
So AJ, I just wanted clarity in what Dr. Pierce talked about, because I guess I wasn't quite at the reporting stage yet. I understand that they have to be succinct reports. I'm very clear on that. So I guess I'm used to when you put out data, you set data points, then we get back an interpretation from the superintendent, and then there's a discussion on how we want to see the data so that we can make and track and monitor in the appropriate way. Was your response
Now,
to Dr. Pierce saying, oh, that was now?
that evaluating the superintendent's interpretation, which is the interim goals, is exactly what you're doing right now. And if you find the interpretation adequate as a means of monitoring, then we'll proceed. If you don't find the interpretation adequate, the interim goals as a means of monitoring, then your option is to live with it and see what implementation reveals, or modify the goals.
Right, but that's not, and maybe I heard incorrectly, that is not, we're not at the step where we're saying how we want to see the data presented.
What they're telling you right now, the interim goals, is the data that they would be presenting in the monitoring reports.
So you're saying I'm just going to see whether I got to 41, I'm only going to see whether they got to 41% or not, and I'm just gonna have to guess.
No, we talked about that at a different meeting, what we wanted to see, and we talked about the things, the data points and explaining, and we had a lot of discussion about that, but I think that's still,
But I don't think we finished it.
okay, but that we can keep
Okay,
keep
that's
talking
my
about that.
question, so,
That's
because
still on
the
the
way that
table.
it came, the way, and again, I don't
I
have to
think it
step
goes
out.
back to, we said that we could, as Dr. Pierce said, some of it will be a presentation that we would give orally, to do a video of the presentation. Some of it will be that data can be in the executive summary. But when we come to the monitoring, the activity, some of that information will be provided to you in different ways. But the questions that we'll be asking will be from these interim goals that we agreed upon. But the
Right.
context of that can be provided in different ways, as Dr. Pierce and others have suggested. Does that make sense? So you want to know how particular student groups are doing?
Correct.
We can provide all that data to you in our summaries or additional data so that you can understand how the entire, for example, third grade is doing, all student groups. But the reporting and the questions would be about these specific interim goals that we've agreed upon.
It's just, again, I'm just used to like saying, so that you're not running around trying to figure out how we want to see what data. I think there should be a standard for you to say, so,
Correct, and I
you
think
know,
we've
and
established.
I know it's not the discussion today, but
Right.
otherwise, you're gonna be doing 7, trying to figure out how to incorporate that in your presentation or in your executive summary.
Yeah.
I know that's for a later discussion, because I think that's what I heard, and it'll reiterate or get fixed as we go through, so I'm okay,
Okay.
just,
And what I'm saying is, no, it's not for later discussion. These are the interim goals, and either the board accepts these as the interim goals and says, this is how we will monitor,
that's not my
or it does
question.
not.
I'm good with that, the fact that they're interim goals. I'm just talking about how I see the data. That's all.
Yes.
She's talking about the
The
reports
reporting,
itself.
the reporting part.
I think we're afraid the report's just gonna have one line that says 45%, not 45%, and it'll have more than that.
Yeah, because I think you guys were very clear at the last meeting about what you wanted to see. And I think this example that AJ gave to us as a team is we can do a lot of that in video presentation, provide that in executive summary with additional documents to show those points, but the monitoring document would be based on these.
I'm just saying, it would be helpful for me that I'm not chasing down 3 or 4 different types of, let me look at the executive summary, let me go see if it's in the PowerPoint. You know what I'm saying? I'm just, there's 7
A
people.
standard, okay.
It would be nice at some point, and I know we'll get there.
Okay.
It's like,
We'll-
what is
we'll get there. She'll
the
re-
standard?
she'll keep
Yeah, that's,
refining
I
how
just
it's
wanted to get
presented.
clarity on that.
So AJ is turning into a pumpkin in 5 seconds.
I agree.
So what I'm hearing,
I
though,
will,
yeah, what I'm hearing, board members, is that you seem to be okay for me putting this on the agenda for our next meeting, to bring it before the board to make a vote. And we can obviously discuss it again at that point, but I'm seeing that we're okay to do that. So that's what we will do. At the next board meeting, we will put this on the agenda, to recommend approval.
my request, Madam Chair, is that at that time, that we also then come back and complete the conversation about next steps, which we won't get to this evening because I need to step away.
Okay. And real quick, AJ, do we need to make sure we change these dates before and provide some evidence of that
I would
before?
recommend you make those adjustments
Before
and bring
next
those
week.
to the board at that
Okay.
time.
Thank you,
Have a blessed
AJ.
evening.
Thank you, AJ.
Thank you, AJ.
Thank you.
Thank you, team.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone. This
Thank
was
you.
actually a
Adjourn.
great discussion.
Second.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
I-
so
I
we are done. There was a motion to adjourn. That is the next item.
I second it.
Hold on a
So
second.
Cole motioned, I second.
Either one, it don't matter.
Wow.
Okay, so everyone is really wants to
On their
leave.
way.
So without objection, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you.
These 2 clocks are different.